Hello, everyone. We're here today for our latest webinar Wednesday presentation. This one is on using LiDAR to develop habitat models for at-risk bird species in Cape Breton. I'm super excited to hear from the presenters on this one. But first, Dalhousie, welcome. I would like to acknowledge that NSCC is located in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory and traditional homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Our relationship is based on a series of peace and friendship treaties between the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Crown, dating back to 1725. As treaty beneficiaries, we recognize that we are all treaty people. NSCC also recognizes the African Nova Scotians as a distinct group who arrived here 400 years ago. From that time on, they've contributed to the infrastructure and economic wealth of the towns and cities they helped to build. Let us learn more about how our respective communities were shaped by the historical contributions of African Nova Scotians to Mi'kma'ki. And now, I'd like to present our presenters. We have two today who have worked on this project. Andrea Doucette is the Superintendent of Certification, Environment and Outreach at Port Hawkesbury Paper, LP, with over 20 years of experience in environmental management and sustainable forestry. She leads forest certification, chain of custody systems, and sustainable forest management initiatives, and has extensive experience working with industry, government, and Mi'kmaq communities to support responsible forestry practices in Nova Scotia. I'd also like to present Dr. Cindy Stacer. Dr. Cindy is a retired biology professor who continues to lead an active research lab at Dalhousie University. Since 1996, she and her students have studied forest bird populations and habitat across Nova Scotia, contributing to monitoring programs, habitat research, and conservation planning. Her current work promotes beneficial management practices for land birds at risk in working forests, with a focus on species at risk surveys, habitat modeling, and stewardship. And now I'll leave it to them to tell you more about this great project. Thank you.
First glitch. Miles, when I share my screen, or when I show my presentation full screen, are you getting that?
Not yet. You have to maybe share through Teams again.
Share through Teams again.
Just right beside the mute button where you unmuted yourself, the share
right
icon.
Yeah. Sorry. That's right.
No problem.
Sorry.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah. No, that's great. Okay. I had to share my screen for you to share your screen. Let me know if I'm good to go.
Good to go. Looks great.
Okay, awesome. Sorry about that, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this webinar and learning more about this project. It's been a fun project to be a part of. We started it, I think, probably about 2 years ago. So what we've titled it as is using LiDAR to develop habitat models for at-risk bird species. And you can see on the screen there's 6 bird species that are listed at-risk species in Nova Scotia. And these are the 6 species that we wanted to focus on for looking at how we can use LiDAR to improve habitat modeling for at-risk bird species. First, I just want to acknowledge the project team. So with the NSCC, the Applied Geomatics Research Group, Dr. Tim Webster was a part of the project. Of course, Dr. Cindy Stacer with Biology Department at Dalhousie. Our intern student from NSCC was Bert Lobb. And then we also had some research scientists with the community college, Kevin Ferris, Kevin McGeegan, and Graham Rice, and then myself. And so I just popped up the logos there of our organizations and included MyTax, which was another funding agency that we were able to procure some funding from for the project. MyTax is a federal nonprofit research organization that funds projects mainly between industry and academia. So we were very fortunate to have the funding from those sources for this project. So first, I'll just kind of summarize what the goals and objectives are of this the project that we've been working on. So really, it's to develop and field validate habitat models for those at-risk bird species shown on the first slide that we know are occurring in Port Hawkesbury Paper's forest management area. And so a big part of that project was using LiDAR point cloud data and other environmental data to extract relevant metrics based on expert opinion. So Cindy's obviously very experienced with birds and habitat and modeling and so on. So she was a key asset for this project, and also, all the literature that's out there about those bird species and their habitat requirements. So all that information feeding into developing habitat models with, the base of that really trying to use LiDAR and see how well we can use that new kind of type of data for seeing if we can make improved habitat models. We validated the habitat models using occurrence data from the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center. Don't know if all the folks on here have heard of that organization, but they're kind of like a data center, data warehouse center for the Maritimes, or maybe Atlantic Canada, I guess Atlantic Canada, for any any wildlife data that people are collecting out in the field, whether it's related to birds, lichens, mammals, coastal plain flora, a whole range of things. So that occurrence data helped in trying to validate the habitat models, and also doing actual field work after some of the model results were providing an output so that we could go to the field and see if things were matching up in terms of, are we actually seeing the birds in these habitats that the models are saying this is where they should be? And then we would adjust those models as needed. The delivery for the project was as a range of GIS products, habitat suitability maps, data package, and reports that would help Port Hawkesbury Paper with our forest planning and conservation measures for at-risk birds. And also a key part is to use this information from the project to help inform our own forest model for our next strategic forest management long-term plan, which we're currently working on right now and will be submitted to government by the end of this year for the next 5-year period. Just quickly, here's the study area for the project. Port Hawkesbury Paper does have a Crown lease agreement with the province, and so on the left side in Cape Breton, those pink areas represent the areas, the Crown lands that we manage in Cape Breton. There's also Crown lands that we manage in Antigonish, Guysborough, and Pictou County, but we did not include those areas in this project or in the study area just because the data load, I think, would have just been too much for the project. So we kind of just wanted to focus on Cape Breton for this study. And then in the middle map, you can see where some of those Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center occurrences are, the points on the map related to those different bird species. And then the far right just shows what the digital elevation model looks like from the LiDAR data. And just quickly, I just want to mention too, so, why does this why is this important for Port Hawkesbury Paper, and why do we want to, obviously manage for wildlife habitat and species at risk? And so we go through a very rigorous planning process, and there's different stages to our planning. At the highest level, we have our strategic planning and analysis, which is really setting our goals and objectives for a 100-year sort of long-term look ahead to what are the key values, whether it's ecosystem, cultural, ecological, social, all those values that you can think of that's important to forests for Nova Scotia and to the public. So we put all those goals and objectives into a simulation model, and then that gets fine-tuned down into a 20-year landscape plan. And the 20-year plan starts to really map out spatially where we think we'll be managing the forest over the next 20-year period. And then from there, we create an annual operating plan, which is right down to the stand level. And through all those processes, we've also developed a set of measurable indicators and targets related to a whole range of different values related to social values, cultural, economic, ecological, and we monitor those indicators and targets over time and see how we're doing with meeting those targets and adjust where we need to. And also through that whole process from top to bottom is being engaged with the public and sharing information with the Mi'kmaq related to that whole process from the 100-year down to 20 down to the stand level operations. So there's kind of different steps in that when you kind of think about at-risk species and what we do in those different steps of the process. So to take it down to the stand level and what we currently do, so for these at-risk bird species, currently in Nova Scotia, there's no best management practice guideline or policy from government right now. So we try and implement and work with government on making sure that we're trying to minimize impacts as much as we can. So currently what we're doing is DNR uses that occurrence data from ACCDC and the species at risk data, along with any other available information we might have during when we're doing our plans for forestry activities. Every plan that we develop is submitted to DNR for their review and approval. And then any restrictions or requirements that we have to meet on the ground is then provided back to us through an approval document from DNR. So for the most part, the species at risk bird data points that are mapped and we know where those are through the CDC database, or maybe it's data that maybe Cindy has related to fieldwork. There's a 500-meter buffer applied around each of those data points. And if any part of our planned operation is falling within that 500-meter buffer, a seasonal timing restriction is typically applied during the nesting season. So there's a timing window that we typically will not go into those areas for harvest. And the nesting season, they're kind of like starting either April 15th or May 1st for a start date, going through to August 31st. So those 500-meter buffered areas, typically we don't harvest those in that breeding nesting season window. So the standard practice is to avoid operations. And those instructions come from the department through those approvals that they provide to us. And so when DNR does their integrated resource management review related to all that, there's mitigation options that might be discussed with the biologist to allow for partial operations in some cases. So an example that we had, I think this might have been last year, we had a large pre-commercial thinning job. So the department approved a reduced 300-meter buffer around a nest so that the remaining areas around that could proceed during nesting season. And I don't know, a pre-commercial thinning treatment, it's not as heavy as a treatment as some other treatments in a more mature stand. So maybe they felt that there was less risk. So it just depends on conversations with the department and with biologists, and determining what is the best option for different areas. So in summary, if a SAR bird is within proximity of an operation, seasonal restriction is generally expected within the 500-meter buffer, but some operations may proceed as agreed upon by the integrated resource management team within the department. And then another thing that we're currently working on as well, this is a project that Port Hawkesbury Paper has worked on with Cindy Stacer, and I believe she's working with other companies as well. Cindy has been exploring trying to test different best management practices for at-risk birds. So we're part of that project. We've provided her with 8 test sites in Cape Breton, and test sites being areas that we, have plans to harvest. And so we would provide that information to her. She went out, did some field tests before harvest. You can see the map on the upper left corner. The OSFL is olive sided flycatcher locations. CAWA is Canada warbler. I think there's a few other ones there. But those point locations are actual locations of either seeing the bird or hearing the bird, maybe seeing a nest, whatever it might be. And so then we get that data back from Cindy. We put 25-meter no-treat buffers around each of those points, and then a 75-meter buffer beyond that with the BMPs, the best management practices that we're going to apply and test them and see how birds respond to that change in habitat. So examples for this particular site was retaining more than 12 standing trees per hectare for song perches, maintaining ground cover, woody debris, shrub structure, leaving tree tops and limbs, avoiding pesticides and herbicides where possible. And PHP has not used herbicides since 1997. So thought it's just important to mention that, and also just, doing some things with where our extraction trails are. And then the intent is to go back after those BMPs are applied on the ground to see what has changed in terms of habitat use by those birds. So that's kind of like what we do at the stand level. But at the landscape level, we didn't really have an effective sort of large landscape management approach for habitat for at-risk birds. So having effective species at risk management requires quantifying and mapping and knowing where all the different wildlife habitat is across the landscape, and also understanding that habitat distribution so that we can manage for those areas appropriately on that larger scale. Some challenges and approaches to this is that trying to do field-based data collection can be costly and time intensive. So computer habitat modeling provides a great way for mapping and predicting habitat, and reliable models depend on high quality ecological data, as well as collaboration with biologists and ecologists and GIS professionals, which is the group we had for this project. And so the role of habitat models is really they help define and predict habitat distribution over time. And the outputs can be integrated into our long-term forest planning models to support our sustainable management initiatives and set targets to try and maintain or enhance habitat across the landscape for species. And models typically use forest inventory data and other environmental data or variables and data. So what we wanted to do with this project was look at whether provincial LiDAR data can help improve habitat modeling even further, and translating those known bird habitat requirements into LiDAR derived metrics or data to better describe and predict suitable habitat. And so that's my kind of beginning to the project. And so I'm going to hand it to Cindy now, and she can kind of go through the meat of the project related to habitat modeling and so on.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Cindy Stacer, and I was really excited to be a part of this project. But really, the people who did most of the work on the project are shown on this screen here. Andrea had mentioned this at the start, but I just want to emphasize that most of the work and a lot of the slides that I'm going to be showing you are from their work. I want to give you sort of a brief overview of some of the main project elements as I saw them occur. It started off with a literature review and expert input, looking at how LiDAR metrics have been used in other studies for modeling habitat, looking at different modeling techniques, and also doing a thorough literature review on the habitat of the different SAR of interest. Next was the workflow and the calculation of LiDAR metrics. And these are all things that were new. They weren't something that you just pull off of GeoNova. But I'll talk a little bit about how they did that. And then it took quite a long time. It took quite a long time to do that. And then the SAR bird data that Andrea talked about from the ACCDC had to be processed, and then they needed to generate rasters of all of the environmental variables, including the LiDAR variables and all of the other ones, because these are used for inputs into the models. Once there were draft models for two of the SAR, the Canada warbler and olive-sided flycatcher, I started looking at those models, comparing them to previous models. They looked pretty good, and then we decided to go out and field test them, so I'll be talking about that. Afterwards, giving feedback from how the models seemed to be working. The models were revised, and they went ahead and developed the models for the other SAR. And so I'll present those in a very brief way in the latter part of the talk. And lastly, I'll talk about their recommendations for use of the models and updating the models. Right, next slide. Sorry, how do I change my slides? It's not working like usual.
You should just be able to click on the slide and it should advance. If not, try the arrow keys on your keyboard.
I've tried all of that.
The space bar, maybe?
It's also not working. Let's see. I'm wondering if I have to reshare everything.
Yeah, that's probably the best thing to do is just, here, I'll just take the slides off the screen, just so stop sharing them, and then reshare it, and I'll put them back on the screen and we can see if that solves the issue.
I think I probably have to, let's see. That was it. Okay, so for the modeling technique, we chose using MaxEnt, or maximum entropy modeling. It's a relatively easy to use package that you can download and use on your computer. AGRG staff started using it with as a sort of a plugin within ArcGIS, but ended up switching to the desktop version because it was had a lot more options. Other reasons why we used it is that there have been several previous projects in Nova Scotia that have used MaxEnt to model shorebird habitat. And a recent study has found that Maxent is among the top performing habitat models. So it's a sort of I think, an easy choice. And this over on the right side is just an example of a model for the olive-sided flatcatcher that we had produced a few years ago for the Bredor Lakes watershed. And so basically you're looking at predicted habitat for the species where, in this case, the red would be the highest suitability and the blue would be the lowest. So maximum entropy modeling uses two types of inputs to predict the species presence or habitat across the landscape. First of all, you need the species occurrence data. These are the locations where a species has been found. And you need digital environmental rasters. You need a combination of those to predict the locations where the habitat should be suitable. The kinds of environmental rasters you might use would be perhaps particular tree species if a bird is associated with, say, black spruce or red oak, particular cover type, various other things from forest inventory data. You might use topography, maybe the distance to or proximity to features that are important to the species, like water, wetlands, clear cuts, burns, or disturbed areas. And really anyone can build a model if you have these two data sets, but you really need expert knowledge to guide the selection of the variables to make a model that makes sense. So I mentioned that there have been models produced for some of these species previously, but there were limitations. And the main limitations, as I see them, were that we were mainly, in terms of their forest habitat, we were mainly only able to use forest attributes from the forest resource inventory, which are, basically telling you what is the habitat at the stand level. But birds are likely selecting habitats at other scales. And you don't have structural variables, for the most part, are not included in FRI data. Things like snags and canopy gaps and large diameter trees. The vertical and horizontal distribution of trees is really important. And then for some species, understory and the shrub layer and the type of ground cover might be really important, etc. And wetness and wet patches. So LiDAR is really a really good opportunity, provided a really good opportunity to see if we could quantify these kinds of features and then make a better predictive model. So as you probably know, LiDAR stands for light detecting and ranging. And this diagram here shows a depiction of airborne LiDAR data collection, where lasers are being shown down to the earth from the airplane, and it's the return back to the airplane that tells us something about what's down below. So basically, each one of those returns is a point in a point cloud and has an X, Y, and Z coordinate. And it basically tells you, by processing the data, it tells you exactly where that point hit, either like a treetop, the ground, or some vegetation in between. The LiDAR used in this project was obtained from GeoNova for all of Cape Breton. It's a huge area, and it was 224 billion points in the point cloud that were used. These are some technical details, but the main thing here is that all of this data, so basically they downloaded the point cloud and reprocessed it so that they could derive a number of different kinds of LiDAR variables. And they did this at a 10 by 10 meter cell size for the entire island of Cape Breton. you may have downloaded from GeoNova the digital elevation model for Nova Scotia or the canopy height model for Nova Scotia. Those have been created based on the point clouds, but those are the only two things that you are sort of like ready-made things you can download. So this project was focusing on developing a number of new metrics that might be telling us something very important about the habitat for different species. So they developed in total over 70 predictors, which were in the form of rasters to put into the model. These included LiDAR-derived vegetation structure variables from canopy height to foliage height diversity, the heterogeneity of the foliage in the vertical and horizontal direction, the density of the vegetation, and so on. They also derived various terrain and surface parameters from, I believe, the digital, similar to a digital elevation model, but in more detail. And then they also used things from the forest inventory and the hydrography and wetlands and roads layers that are available on GeoNova so that we could include things like distance to wetlands and water and roads and so on. And so I'm just going to show you some examples of some of these variables that went into the models. So this is a calculation of understory vegetation density. So it's the basically the density of vegetation in the layer 0 to 1.3 meters. They also calculated a mid-story vegetation density in the 1.3 to 5 meter range. And overstory, the proportion of vegetation returns greater than 5 meters compared to the total number of vegetation returns. They calculated a topographic position index, which has been used in some other models. And then using the FRI, calculated the distance to urban features. So this is on the left side, you can see sort of a close-up of the raster. On the right side is the raster for all of Cape Breton. What you see, if you can see my mouse, these are the roads, and the darker area means that it's farther from the roads. And so these areas up here that are most dark are the farthest from roads. And that's basically how the distance to features rasters work. This is another distance to feature, in this case, distance to water. And those lines on the left side now, the blue lines are now water courses. Distance to mapped wetlands. You can see the little blue shapes on the left are lakes. And you can see that the further you are from the lake, the darker the shade. And so it's basically it's a way of incorporating into the model how far away a point on the landscape is from water. They also calculated a topographic wetness index, which is showing you the potential for water accumulation. And they used the wet areas map that's been developed by the province. They used satellite data. They used Google Earth's engine, continuous change detection and classification, to update the data in terms of what areas have been cleared or burned basically have changed since the force inventory was done or since LiDAR was flown. And this is a radar-derived index. It's an index of deciduousness that they developed. And you can see this is during the summertime, and then the next slide is the calculation based on changes in the reflectance in the winter. So you can sort of broadly categorize the landscape into how deciduous it is. So those were a few examples of the 70 plus rasters that they developed for use in the models. Now I want to sort of focus in on, how does the model work? What does it look like? What are the metrics that are that we use to evaluate a model? So over on the right side of this slide is one of the models for the olive-sided flycatcher. In this case, again, red is the highest level of suitability, and blue is the lowest level. And on the left side, this is a graph that is showing the area under the curve. And basically, this is telling you how well the model is separating good habitat from poor habitat. If it could not separate it at all, the points would be right along this straight line in the middle. If it was doing a perfect job, it would be like this. And so this is doing a reasonable job of separating areas that it thinks is good habitat and poor habitat. Other things that Maxent gives you to evaluate the model are basically you might give it a dozen or so different variables that you think are important, and you will go through and systematically remove the one that seems least important and end up with maybe 4 or 5 at the end. And so for this model, we ended up with 5. The variables are shown here in the table on the left in terms of the percent contribution to the model, how much having that variable in the model added to the model, and also the permutation importance and how important that variable is to the model. So if you took it out of the model, how much the model would decline in suitability. And then on the bottom here, we have response curves, and these show how the suitability values change with model, with the value of the variable. So for example, this is a canopy height model, 95% of the vegetation, and you can see that its suitability is increasing with the values. Here you have distance to black spruce, and here you can see that it is declining with the distance to black spruce, and so on. So we, given the first drafts of the models, I compared them to the models that we had created before, and they looked like they were doing a much better job. The models with the LiDAR data were doing a much better job than the models that we had prepared without LiDAR. And at that point, we said, okay, we would like to test these models. So we did this in late summer of 2024. Unfortunately, the models weren't ready early enough in the season to do singing surveys, so we had to base our tests on what the habitat actually was at the sites. So we selected, we were able to survey 23 sites for each model. We tried to space each of the sites at least 1 kilometer apart for a given model. The purple here is showing the the PHP managed lands, and the green diamonds are showing the olive-sided flycatcher model sites, and the Canada warbler sites are shown in the yellow crosses. So we went out in order to choose the site. What we did was we looked at in this case, the model colors are flipped, where red is the lowest and blue is the highest. We mapped the models in ArcGIS and produced, and we were basically looking for areas that were accessible, that had dark blue values, which are the highest level. So basically 2 standard deviations above the mean. So around in the 90%, or proportions. And you can see here, these are the same 2 sites on both sides. On the left side is the Canada warbler model. And so the little yellow cross is showing this is a site that we chose for Canada warbler. And on the right side is that same site, but now this is the olive-sided flycatcher model. And so this site here, the East Judique 2, is the one we tested for olive-sided flycatcher. East Judique SD was tested for the Canada warbler model. But we actually collected data so that we could look at, you know, how suitable is that habitat for both of the species at each of the sites we went to. But I'll just be focusing on how each model, how the suitability for a particular model. So if we look at for those sites, the mean for the average model values in the area around those points was about 0.31 for the Canada warbler model, and about 0.35 for the olive-sided flycatcher model. When we add 2 standard deviations to that, we get these values here, 0.8894 and 0.8735. And so that color ramp, where it was showing dark blue, was basically showing things that were 2 standard deviations above the mean or higher. And if we look at the mean predicted value for the Canada warbler models sites, they at the 25-meter buffer area, so that's about 8 10 by 10 cells, it was about 0.91. For olive-sided flycatcher, about 0.89. And then as you look at a larger area, so now we're looking at 30 cells around that point, the predicted suitability is declining, which makes sense because you're going further away from that point of highest suitability. So what we did was we did habitat surveys at each of these sites. We assessed the habitat within a 25-meter radius circle of the point. We did determined the FEC vegetation type and the drainage, measured the canopy cover. We did a prism sweep. We recorded the stand type and stand age, and then measured the tree layer heights and species, noted whether there were emergence, what's the height of the emergence versus the main canopy, how patchy it is, and what percent of snags were at the site. We looked at the high shrub layer, which was the 1.3 to 5 meters, and we measured the height, the percent cover, how dense were the shrub stems, and then we looked at the abundance of the different species and the heights, and we distinguished between which ones were trees and shrubs. We looked at the low shrub layer, which was 0.15 to 1.3 meters, and collected similar information. And the ground layer noted whether there was sphagnum, how much sphagnum versus other mosses and liverworts and other plants were present. And we looked at the ground topography and wetness, including, noting fallen woody debris, upturned roots, hummocks, standing water, and running water. And we documented all of this with photos. And then we summarized all this information in a one-page summary, which you can see here, showing pictures at the top of the canopy, the shrub layers, the lower layers, and then the ground. And then we also have graphs of the percent cover of the tree layer, the tall shrub layer, and the low shrub layer. And then we listed how suitable was this site actually for the birds. So in this case, it was a site, a model site for Canada warbler. It's a model predicted score was very, very high, 0.9805, but it was really, the suitability was low. So when we compare all of the sites together, the model predicted high suitability for all the test sites all had high predicted suitability, but their field assessed suitability based on what the habitat actually was at the site was variable, and only about half of the sites were actually suitable habitat. So if you look here, for the Canada warbler test sites, about 11 were suitable and about 12 were unsuitable, and about 12 were suitable for olive-sided flycatcher and 11 were unsuitable. So we also looked at, well, why were these sites suitable or unsuitable? So the main reasons for predicted high suitability sites being unsuitable for Canada warbler were that they lacked a true tall shrub layer. So some of the sites had no vegetation in that layer, but mostly they were unsuitable because there was vegetation in this layer, but it was regenerating trees rather than shrub species. So they really need a dense shrub layer. Or it was a tall shrub layer that was poorly developed, or it lacked other site features like cinnamon fern and a wet complex ground for nesting. The main reasons that high suitability sites for olive-sided flycatcher were not actually suitable were that either they were the wrong forest type. For example, they were not black spruce dominated sites. They might have been the right forest type, but it was too young. There were quite a few sites like that. But those sites are expected to become more suitable in the future. And or they lack the foraging space and suitable perch sites, including snags. So basically, if it's not black spruce and it's not old enough, you generally don't end up having the kind of structure that the birds need. So we provided all this feedback to AGRG, and they continue to work on revising the models. And I have time. I would like to go through those briefly with you. So Canada warbler breeds in forested wetlands. Its sites tend to have a scattered canopy, and it uses emergent trees as singing and lookout perches. It can occupy any wet forest type that has the tall shrub layer. And so what does the final model show for this? So for the Canada warbler, the most important variable was proximity to mapped wetlands. And the next was the sort of the mid-story tall shrub layer. And another wet indicator wet area indicator, and the fourth one was canopy closure. For olive-sided flycatcher, black spruce dominated stands with older, taller, scattered trees, and many snags are important. The model found 5 variables to be important. The distance to black spruce stands, the distance to mapped wetlands, the distance to recent harvest or edge openings, exposed ridges and openings, and tall emerging crowns, which is what I was saying the birds need for foraging. The rusty blackbird needs basically a lot of streams and wetlands in its habitat. And the Maxent models found the most important variables to predict its habitat were wetland proximity, depth to the water table, proximity to streams and lakes, distance to disturbed areas, and the amount of dense lower vegetation because they nest in young spruce and fir, and also topography where you have a lot of wet flats and shallow groundwater. Common nighthawk nests on bare ground and forages over wet areas. The variables used in the common nighthawk model were distance to clear cuts or open ground, deciduousness, distance to wetlands, canopy height, the enclosure, exposure of the landscape, and wind exposure. Now, this model does not look as good as the other models. You can see that the area under the curve is a lower number, and that curve is closer to the sort of the random line here. The eastern wood pewee is a mature forest species, needing older trees in a multi-age canopy. In its model, we have the mature canopy LiDAR indicator here, proximity to forest that has been cut, degree of deciduousness, distance to softwood stands, the amount of exposure of the landscape, and the heterogeneity of the upper canopy, in other words, a mixed stand. Evening grosbeak is a bird that breeds in mature and older coniferous and mixed wood stands and nests in tall conifers. The variables important for this species were a tall canopy for nesting, the degree of deciduousness, distance to edges, a topographic position in the valley river relief complex, and proximity to streams and water bodies. So overall, the high resolution at the 10-meter scale of habitat suitability rasters were produced for each SAR across the Cape Breton domain. And the dominant drivers were consistent with the literature and previous modeling work. Proximity to wetlands and water had a strong positive influence for the wetland-associated and riparian species, such as variables such as distance to wetland or distance to streams, wet areas mapping, and topographic wetness indexes. Urban or edge context, open edge-associated species showed a nonlinear response to distance from development and recent clear-cutting. And lastly, LiDAR-based forest structure was important, and it was driven by canopy height percentiles, for example, the 95 percentile, canopy cover, and the vertical diversity, including foliage height diversity, stratified density, so those densities of those 3 different layers. And AGRG recommends that these SAR suitability layers be added to pre-work checks for harvest, road alignment, and silviculture. That they be used as decision aids, and perhaps using the top 10 to 20% quantiles to flag areas for review. To summarize multi-species hotspots, so you could look at the models together and see what areas have more than one species, and to do more work on field verification. And as new data become available, new ACCDC data, new LiDAR data, etc., that the models be updated. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cindy and Andrea. So we do have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. I should have shared before, but you're able to place questions in the Q&A area. You can alternatively put it in chat if you're more comfortable with that. And I believe, Miles, pipe in and say no, but I believe you can also raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask a question verbally as well. So yeah, just feel free to pipe in. I have one quick question myself. I was wondering, if you were to make an improvement upon these LiDAR models, and do kind of a next iteration of this kind of study, what types of variables would you be looking to find out if they need to be added or tweaked or used differently within the model?
Well, one of the things that I would like to do is look at how I would like to take a really close look at some of the LiDAR metrics and overlay them on, like I have drone imagery for the study sites that we've been monitoring in Cape Breton, and I'd like to see how that kind of maps over the drone imagery and whether those LiDAR variables are actually capturing what I think they're capturing.
So yeah, verification through another like remote sensing input. That makes a lot of sense. You see if we have anything in the chat or the Q&A yet. So David Heatley just asked if we can get a copy of the presentation. It was wonderful, and knowing the main variables for public data makes it a resource-friendly system. David, I'm not totally sure if you're asking this presentation as we're showing right now. That will be available as a recording and backup on the Center for Forest Innovation subsite. And as somebody that attended, you'll also receive a follow-up link, I believe. But in terms of if you're asking about Stacy's presentation or Andrea's, would either of you be able to respond about how you might be able to share?
Yeah, I'm happy to share it. I can, if maybe the best way is to provide it to Bethany and then have you distribute it. Because I don't know if how I'd have, folks' email addresses or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That could work because we have your email addresses from your registration. So we could get it to you that way. For those, although I think I might have yours, David. And I same for you, Stacy, I take it?
Yep.
Okay. And do we have anything else that people are interested about? I guess I have one last question. I was wondering for you, Andrew, when you're engaging with the public and with Mi'kmaq, what do you hear back from them about their interest in species at risk birds?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's, really focused on one particular thing. It's really about the forest in general and, wanting to see the forest managed in a way that takes care of all the different values and interests and reasons why we love to go to the forest, whether it's recreational use or conservation, wilderness areas, research for folks like Cindy. It's a whole range of things for sure. But definitely species at risk is, I think, obviously a very important area to definitely consider and manage for with forest management, no matter where we are in Canada. So for me, I've always kind of had this interest with wildlife going back to my university days and doing thesis work on Canada lynx. And so I see the importance for sure myself. And so that's why I really wanted to kind of pursue something related to at-risk species at a landscape scale, because I knew, for us with our strategic modeling and kind of, forecasting out the forest 100 years from now, well, how do we know if we're providing adequate habitat for different bird species? So there's things like marten that we manage for Canada lynx, but we didn't really have something that we could kind of use and as an input into the strategic model. So yeah, and then just our relationship with Cindy and her other project that she has going as well. And and we came up with this idea to see, well, let's see if we can, improve some of the habitat modeling using the LiDAR data, and then how we can take that information, like Port Hawkesbury Paper, take that information and use that to help inform our own planning for ourselves. And so I'll just mention, yesterday we just had a planning committee team meeting, and we went through the different wildlife species that we're including in our strategic model. And so there's the rusty blackbird, eastern wood pewee, and olive-sided flycatcher. So those three for sure. We've got sort of the habitat parameters identified, which, a lot of that came through Cindy's work in this project. And so it's, obviously a work in progress, and it's not always perfect, but it's learning as we go. And, as Cindy said, an AGRG recommending that, 3 to 5 years time, look at what new data is out there and, continually try and improve those habitat models and gain new information so that we can make the best informed decisions in our forest management.
That's a terrific way to keep building upon what we have. And I feel like species at risk are something that it's a very concrete topic that almost everybody can understand why it's important.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I don't see anything else in the chat. So I think I just like to thank both of you. I found this to be such an interesting project. I'd been working in the voucher program that this project had received some funding for, along with my tax, and we're not supposed to have favorites, but I have to admit it was kind of a favorite.
Awesome.
So it was just terrific work. And thank you so much to Miles for all of your help with the tech. Like every time we have one of these, I'm so grateful that we have good tech help. And Jocelyn just wants to say thank you. It was a great project. So
yeah,
Jocelyn works in applied research at NSCC. And so I'm going to share my screen to let everybody know about our upcoming event. And here. In a moment. And so next week, we're going to have conserving working forests utilizing carbon offset sales. And that will be on March 4th, 2026. I hope to see all of you, and I'm just wishing you best in the meantime, and we'll hope for great weather and happy days.
Great. Thanks so much, Bethany and Miles, and
thanks so
thanks
much,
to everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.